Good day and welcome to our final Rand Swiss wrap of the week for the year 2022. You're basically going to be taking a little break and coming back to you again in January. In this last wrap, we're going to cover three topics as usual. One is the Eskom situation, next is the US Fed, and finally we'll just do a little kind of wrap up of what happened in 2022 and what we expect to happen in 2023. Okay, let's start off with Eskom. The rater, basically the CEO has resigned. He claims that he was sabotaged by the board. Things were signed without his approval. He had no insight as to what's happening, and he decided that this wasn't just worth the effort, and he resigned. We've had ongoing load shedding for a decade plus at the moment. This year has been the worst of that. We have seen, for instance, level 6, which we've only seen like once previously, happened twice this year, one previously in total. We've seen basically a drop-off in capacity by our generators for quite some time. The trend seems to be going down, and there's not even basically a slowing down or a stopping happening at the moment. And of course, Eskom is going to start asking for yet more money, and we might be lucky to get away with less than the 20% increase next year. So that is the situation in South Africa around Eskom. So let's just see how this is going to affect you. Firstly, we are seeing that the big corporates, the mines especially, are looking for their own generation. That makes sense. If you can generate yourself, if you have a profitable enough enterprise, you don't want to be basically at the mercy of Eskom just to save a few bucks. So yeah, that is happening. We are seeing individuals going on and using solar, petrol generators, a number of other different factors out there. We are seeing the retailers even attempt to do that. We had Mr. Price come out this year and say I think they had thousands of hours or tens of thousands of hours in total of lost time, basically because of the fact that they had load shedding and their stores could not operate at full capacity. And yes, you mentioned that as one of the reasons that they were under pressure this year. And so we expect that to happen. We expect us to become more and more energy independent, decentralized from the grid. Now, that's a good thing because, of course, it means that you're independent, but it's a bad thing because the way South Africa works at the moment is that the rich subsidize the poor to a certain extent. You remove the rich, payers of electricity, the people that are basically have the money to go out and get solar, they have the money to get their own generation in place. And what's going to be left with is the poor people that can't afford solar and that don't actually, carry their own weight in inverted commerce for Eskom. So that's probably going to mean Eskom is going to become more and more of a burden because they basically are losing the revenue payers, and they obviously are going to maintain the people that they have to supply to, irrespective of revenue. So what is that going to mean? That's going to mean that the South African government is eventually going to have to be involved. Now, we've gotten some really, really large payments from the EU and other world bodies to actually get our system or energy generation off coal and fossil fuels, etc., into more renewables and so on. That, of course, is not going to be enough to do it entirely. The government's going to have to step up to a large extent beyond that. We also have seen a large level of corruption, so I don't know, even if they had the money available, would the Eskom could be able to actually achieve this level of self-sufficiency or competence, let me say, or capacity required to keep the country running. So I do think that in the next several years you're going to find Eskom debt becoming a bigger burden on the South African government, and there's going to be a temptation like prescribed assets. I think is going to be really tempting because if you take even like 10% of the assets that are in South African pension funds and say they have to be going towards some kind of bond, just like an Eskom bond or something, that would be more than enough to basically clear all of Eskom's debts, and we can give them a little extra money on top of that. So I think that is one of the dangers that we're going to experience going forward. I think that the danger around capacity, around production is going to disappear because people are going to be becoming more and more efficient, or more self-sufficient rather, with regards to the generation of electricity. All the productive parts of society are going to basically be able to get themselves off the grid. If you're making some reasonable money, you'll be able to get yourself off the grid as a company, an enterprise and so on. Some things are not going to be viable anymore, like smelting and so on, maybe. But other stuff like mining and general like retail and whatever else you're talking about will probably be ongoing with even with Eskom not being there. But I do think Eskom's problems are going to translate reasonably soon into either some pressure on the pension funds or pressure on government debt, which is obviously going to be quite bad for the country overall. Okay, then there's the US Fed. Now, over the last few months, we've seen U.S. inflation come down quite significantly, and surprised a couple of times on the downside. That's obviously a big positive. Like I mentioned a couple, times before, I think there's basically a splitting in the world between the U.S. inflation rate and the global, like European and like African and part of the developing world inflation rates. The U.S. inflation rate is falling. European inflation rate is not falling that much, and might actually be hitting a peak early next year as they are dealing with the issues around winter, as well as the Russian sanctions situation with energy. So the US had a better than expected inflation scenario. At the same time, the Fed has come out and been a lot more aggressive around what's happening with regards to interest rates. Why? Doesn't make sense. I mean, if inflation is falling, why are you so aggressive around interest rates? It doesn't make sense. You should be basically drawing back. To give an example of this, in the last Fed meeting just a few days ago, the Fed, the dot plot where the expectations are for where the interest rates are going to peak and so on over the next few months to a year, that actually rose. So there were fewer people that were expecting a low level of peak, let me say, with the interest rates in the US than previously, even though in between we had these low inflation numbers. So inflation had come out and it had been lower than expected in between the two kind of readings we got, but this last reading they were more aggressive with regards to interest rate hikes. Why is that? And the one thing I think we could point to is the fact that the job market still remains incredibly strong in the US, and I think that's the fear that the Fed has. Why? The Fed's not going to bring interest rates down to below 3% in the next year or two. It's going to drift down, maybe 2024, 2025, it gets to that level. But it's not going to happen anytime soon. And what they're fearful, I think, is that if we go into a situation where inflation is 5-6% for a couple of years, and we have a really tight job market, what's going to happen is that people are going to ask for wage increases. Simple. If workers have real power at their jobs, and they are experiencing a couple of years of say 4, 5, 6% inflation, forget about the 9% we experienced in the last year or so, they are going to ask for 4, 5, 6% interest, so wage increases, maybe a little more to compensate for that 9% that they saw a little while back. Why is that a problem? Like I've said many times before, inflation with commodities, inflation with goods is not a major problem. Why? Because it goes up, it goes down. Look at the oil price, went to 130, came back to 70 something, now it's about 80 something. It goes up and down, not a problem. Petrol prices even go up and down. Okay, shockingly, people forget about this, but petrol prices do occasionally fall. What does not fall is wages. Wages just don't fall. Once wages go up to a certain level, they do not come down from that level. And once they go up, for successive years by a certain amount, that is the amount that they will go up the next year. Okay, if for instance you have a situation where workers have been experiencing a 6 to 7% inflation, the wage increase for say a couple of years, the next year, even if inflation comes down, they are not going to be saying, oh yeah, we're going to bring our wage increase for the next year down from 6 to 7 to 1%. No, they're going to say that's what we get 6 to 7% every year wage increases. You see what I mean? They might bring it down to 4 or 5, but they're not going to bring it down to 1. Even inflation had fallen to 1. That's what translates and makes inflation of goods and services, or goods really, into long-term ongoing inflation. Supply shocks, that's what translates as a supply shock, which is a shortage of oil or whatever it may be, or increase the price of a certain commodity. That's what translates that into longer-term inflation. It's actually wages. Without the wage part here, you can have inflation go down quite easily. But when wages get involved, it's a far different story. And I think that is why the Fed is so concerned, because the wage market, the employment market in the US at the moment remains incredibly tight. We are going through a period where baby boomers are retiring. There's a big cohort after World War II that were born. They're hitting peak retirement now. Okay, the amount of people available to work in the developed world is falling. Okay, even in places like China, working age populations are falling. This means that as a worker, you're going to find the power shifting towards you. And if you are experiencing wage increases of 1 or 2%, while inflation that you're experiencing is 6 to 7, that won't last when you have power. You will translate that power into higher wages. Okay, and I think that's maybe what the Fed is feeling at the moment, and that's why we are seeing this ongoing hiking up of their target high interest rate even though inflation is coming down. It's because they are seeing the wage market, so the jobs market, the employment market still remain quite tight, and they're fearful of that translation happening. Okay, and now let's do a little wrap of the year and what we expect for 2023. Look, 2022 was very eventful. We had the stuff that we expected to happen, Xi Jinping basically staying in power. We had the midterm elections in the US. Those kind of things were like node events. We had the fall of Boris Johnson, which was not an unknown event. We had, of course, the war with Ukraine and Russia, which is definitely not a known event. And we obviously had, the ongoing issues with COVID in China, which kind of like you might have anticipated, but the extent to which they were willing to do it, and the particular protests were probably unpredictable. Iran, but that's also an unknown event, and the repercussions are going to be ongoing from that. So let's just see how that's going to translate to the next year. So firstly, let's start off with what I think is very key, which people may be kind of like putting on the back burner right now, but it's still a key important issue, and that's what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and also with Iran at the moment. Okay, the Russians effectively have chosen a little axis, okay, or had an axis chosen for them. This is what they basically left with. It's Iran, which is supplying these drones. They live in a place like North Korea. They have had some tepid support from places like China, but they've come into a very small group of people willing to help them, or countries willing to help them. Those places are really unstable, but also really key for world trade. So, with regards to what's happening with the Ukraine-Russia war, we expect next year, if there is not a major issue happening in the winter, for it to become a grinding event. So it's going to be multiple years while this kind of just goes on and on and on. And the problem with that is that Russia, Ukraine still remains a key source of many raw materials, a key source of energy, a key source of food, especially for the world. And if we are experiencing, this war grinding on, we're going to see some of the inflationary effects we saw in food this year, even though it'll come back down a little bit, occur again next year. We're going to see, for instance, fertilizer prices remaining high and feeding into higher food prices, causing problems in much of the developing world. We're going to see gas prices remaining quite high, and that's going to cause, gas prices globally to be under pressure. We are also going to see, possibly, some kind of industrial sabotage happening. We've already seen that Nord Stream pipeline blow up, and everyone pretty much now knows that was an event of sabotage. It was done on purpose. There was probably an explosion required for that to occur. It was a purposeful explosion. I think that we might be in danger of something like that happening again in the future. And if not, right now, it's going to be a threat for a while. As long as the conflict is ongoing, Russia basically cannot just let the world get by without its power. It has to have some kind of look there. With regards to food, natural gas means nitrogen fertilizer. At the same time, Belarus, Russia, also important for other kinds of fertilizer as well. Ukraine, Russia, important for just the growing of food. We're going to find food prices under pressure, and we're going to find emerging markets especially in trouble. You're already seeing places like Ghana, which were really, really strong in the last couple of years, under a huge amount of financial stress right now. Places like Peru also in trouble. We're going to see that in much of the emerging world. Okay, that is the Russia situation. Next, China. China is going to be ramping up its offensive, I think, against the West for the next little while. Why? Because they are being attacked in certain ways. Because the Biden administration has gone out and basically forbidden the export of certain kinds of chips and equipment required to make chips to China. The Chinese know that this is an existential threat to their economy and to their basically power. Without these chips that are made in the West, they're not going to be able to basically continue progressing as an economy. So that's going to mean that they're going to try and make their own chips, their own fabrication, etc. Now this is, as I've said in the past, probably the most sophisticated area of human advancement or human development. The manufacture of computer chips is, I think, something we've taken further than we've taken any other field of technology. Cars, aeroplanes, nothing compares to the advancements we've made in relative terms to what we're doing in chips. In chips, we are actually at the very edge of physics at the moment. That means it's very difficult to basically just wrap up production. So the Chinese are basically going on to decade-old technologies to like restart their chip manufacturing, and they're obviously going to try and progress from here. That's going to be an ongoing threat. Not just that, the Chinese interest in Taiwan is also very important, because Taiwan happens to be one of the major chip manufacturers, of especially advanced chips in the world. If they are attacked by the Chinese, it's probably going to be either those fabrications units are either going to be temporarily cut off in the West or permanently cut off if they're destroyed. There's a threat that the Taiwanese may just decide to bomb them to basically make sure that they don't fall into the hands of the Chinese and act like a poison pill. That is something I think that is a danger, and something that's going to be an ongoing danger going forward. We've also seen, of course, with what's happened in Russia, the Chinese becoming aware of just how weak they are with regards to financial services. I've talked to you about in the past about the power of the financial services sector in the West and how it's able to do things, for instance, like try and put a cap on oil just based on insurance policies. That is going to incentivize the Chinese to try and get their own financial system on the go, possibly a parallel system, maybe including places like India, but definitely including places like China, places like Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and so on, maybe in parts of Africa. When you get a separate financial system in the world, it's a real big change to what the world looked like over the last little while. We've got into an expectation that, for instance, the oil price is the oil price around the world. That may not be true going forward, because there's going to be oil for the West and oil for the East. That's going to be separate. We might expect things, for instance, like there's an iron ore price or the coal price or the price of any particular commodity, and that might be changing. That's not going to be a global price. There'll be a price for the West and a price for the East. And that, I think, is an important issue that we've got to look forward into the future. And then finally, probably the most important, for just market, straightforward market event, it's not a black swan event, but just the straightforward market thing, is what the Fed is going to do in the next year or so. It appears that the Fed is going to be strong. It's going to basically try and raise rates to levels that we weren't anticipating in order to break the back of inflation. I think it will raise rates to levels we weren't anticipating, and I don't think it will break the back of inflation. I think we are going to see the Fed basically pulling back just well before inflation is broken, because the economic pain that comes through the requirement for job losses is going to be very difficult to manage when we have an election the following year in 2024. So 2023, I expect the Fed to pivot. Okay, I don't think the Fed is going to be able to break the back of inflation, and I don't think that we're going to be seeing, them holding the line, especially approaching the election. So, Fed pivoting a little earlier than expected, possibly. The Fed pivoting before inflation breaks, almost very likely. Okay, that I think is going to be the key defining normal market event of the year. Of course, excluding a black swan event, for instance, like a Russia-Ukraine nuclear bomb or something like that there. And I think that is meaning the following. The market is probably going to be finding a bottom, if not already, but reasonably soon. And I think we're probably going to be seeing this 2022, 2023 year time period as we saw 2008, 2009 as an opportunity to buy. Okay, that is my views for 2023 and 2024 going forward, as a little wrap up of the past year. Have a good holiday, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next year, January. Cheers.